14th Amendment, Section 3 is pretty clear. If you engage in acts of insurrection or rebellion against the government, or you give aid and comfort to those who do, you are disqualified from running. It doesn't require that you be convicted of insurrection. It just requires that you have engaged in these acts. It's a disqualification from holding office again, and it fits Donald Trump to a T. I think this will be tested when his Secretary of State either refuses to put him on the ballot or puts him on the ballot and is challenged by a litigant. I would imagine it will go up to the Supreme Court, and that's the big question mark through all of this, which is, what will the Supreme Court do? But I do think it is a very legitimate issue. By the clear terms of the 14th Amendment, he should be disqualified from holding office.
Oh, this is great. Okay, let's talk about this first. We'll talk about the 14th Amendment Clause 3, which was after the Civil War about Confederate generals. And then we'll go one by one through all the groups of indictments and make sense of all this. There's no one better to do this with than William Jacobson. He's the founder of the website Legal Insurrection. Please check that website out often. It is a fantastic website, and he's a law professor at Cornell University. Professor Jacobson, how are you, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Let's do that first. Let's do 14th Amendment Clause 3. Says that if someone swears an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and then leads an insurrection or rebellion, they're not able to hold office again. What do we need to know about the context of that and the application here with Donald Trump?
Well, that was a post-Civil War provision. It's meant to deal with the Confederacy and the actual Civil War and rebellion against the government. A violent war, obviously, hundreds of thousands of people died. And so that's what it was meant to do. And it also gave the Congress and the legislatures a way to relieve people of that. And I believe many, if not most, were, so they could, participate. But that's what it was. It was post-Civil War. It was post the insurrection against the United States. It's unclear whether it would apply to the sort of things we're talking about now, which is contesting an election. So there was no, armed struggle. There was no armed revolt against the government. Other than Ashley Babbitt, no one was killed in the January 6th riot. And the very interesting thing is, while Trump has been indicted many times, he's never been indicted for the January 6th riot. And that's something that people overlook. So to the extent, the January 6th riot could be construed as some sort of insurrection, he's actually not been indicted for that. And then the question becomes, lacking an indictment, lacking criminal charges, lacking any judicial finding, lacking a legislative finding that he engaged in insurrection, can a Secretary of State or other more local state official just choose to keep him off the ballot? And I think that's something the court's going to have to determine. But if we do get to that point, we're talking about complete mayhem in our electoral system.
Absolutely. So the legal scholars who threw this out originally, their argument was that, yes, of course, this was originally intended for post-Confederate generals or whatever, but it was written vague enough to apply for future generations. Do you agree with that point?
Well, I think the question is, was it written so vaguely that it could be applied in a situation like this, which is an election contest where someone's disputing an election? This has certainly never been applied that I'm aware of in this context before. We have had Democrats who've objected. We've had Democrats who objected to certification of electors. We've had Democrats who've presented alternative elector slates, I should say. So whether it's vague or not, it's never been applied in this way. And also, again, he's not been charged with the January 6th riot, but we've had riots at the Capitol before. We've had disruptions at the Capitol. We've had disruptions of official congressional proceedings by protesters, sometimes very aggressively. We saw that with the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, where protesters disrupted the hearings and tried to prevent them from taking place and took over the building. And nobody was charged with insurrection for those. So the question a court's going to have to grapple with, if a state official keeps him off the ballot on that own initiative, is, does this apply anymore? Does it apply outside of the Confederate generals context? And was it ever intended to apply to this sort of common electoral dispute?
Yeah, that last question is the most important. I think those guys wrote it knowing that something like a civil war could happen again, so this would again be relevant. But the problem here is this clearly wasn't an insurrection, which is what the Constitution Amendment says. It has to be an insurrection in January 6th, and nothing of it was. The last point on this, and then we'll move to the groups of indictments. The point they keep making, these guys, is that this is self-executing, which is fascinating. They're like, oh, he doesn't need to be convicted, Professor. He doesn't need to be convicted in the court of law. He doesn't need to be convicted in the Senate. It's just poof. It's just done. It's just known, done deal. That's very interesting. I've never heard of something like that before.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Constitution, in a sense, in many ways, is self-executing. It's only when your rights are denied that you have to take affirmative steps, like going to court, to enforce them. So we expect that the government will not restrict our speech. And when the government does it, then we have to go seek to remove that barrier. But think about what they mean in this context. You could have 100, you could have 1,000 local officials taking it on their own initiative to keep people off the ballot based on their own determination of what constitutes an insurrection. Would a Secretary of State in a Republican-run state have the ability to say, well, Joe Biden opening up our border to foreigners, including people bringing fentanyl across the border and killing thousands of Americans, I consider that to be an insurrection against our rule of law and against our immigration laws. Can a Republican do that to Joe Biden? I don't think anybody is advocating for that, but I don't think the Democrats would like that. So what they're saying is, in the absence of some judicial or legislative finding that somebody has engaged in insurrection, it's a free-for-all. It's whoever can get away with whatever they can get away with. And I don't think that's what the framers of the Constitution intended by this provision.
Nothing like this has ever been done before. It's called Politics by Faith with me, Mike Slater. We are bombarded with news all day long, and I don't know about you, but it makes me anxious and worried and all these not good feelings. So in Politics by Faith, we take the news of the day, we lament the brokenness of it, and then we take the turn and we give you a biblical or historical perspective, and hopefully that will bring you some peace so that you can fall asleep at night and reminding you of what is in your control and also what is not. Hopefully this will change our perspective of how we look at the stories of the day. Politics by Faith, it's available now everywhere you download podcasts. Politics by Faith with Mike Slater.